June 6, 1944, 1:15 hours. The co-tent in Peninsula, France. Major Friedrich von der Heydte stood watching. For him, war was usually something that could be seen, calculated, and understood. He was a man of the old Prussian tradition. He was a veteran who had jumped into the heat of Crete, fought through the sands of North Africa, and survived the East. His nerves weren't tempered steel, but standing at the window of his calm and post near Carrington on this pitch-black summer night, he felt a sensation that no previous battle had ever provoked. He listened and his blood ran cold. It was not what he saw. At first it was a distant drone, a vibration in the air, but within minutes the sky above the peninsula was filled with sound. It was the heavy rhythmic thrumming of aircraft engines, not hundreds of them, thousands. The sound came from everywhere at once. A low mechanical thunder that seemed to swallow the night itself. Von der Heydte knew exactly what that sound meant clearly. He knew that within the next 3 hours the black sky would tear open and drain down more than 13,000 paratroopers. What he did not know was that the chaos of this assaulted disaster by military standards would become its greatest weapon. The Americans were not arriving in neat formations. They were arriving scattered, disorganized, and often without their weapons. They would land in flooded marshes, on steep rooftops, in trees, and directly on top of German positions, terrifying the Wehrmacht. To understand the sheer scale of the psychological shock that was about to hit the German army, you must understand their mind. This was arguably the most professional fighting force in the world. Its officer corps had been trained in a deep tradition. To a German officer, war was a science of chessboard. You identified where the enemy was and you applied overwhelming force. This doctrine of precision had allowed them to conquer Poland in 27 days and bring France to its knees in 6 weeks. The German military machine rolled across Europe with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, but there was a vulnerability. The German system depended on order and knowing where the enemy was. On the night of June 6, the Americans shattered this. Not because they were better trained or had superior weapons, but because they did something the Germans could not comprehend. They fought effectively in complete and total chaos. The German command structure on that night was a study in catastrophic timing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was not even in France. He had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. He was convinced the weather was too poor for an invasion, but the irony ran deeper for General Lieutenant Wilhelm Effali. The commander of the 91st Luftland Division, a unit specifically trained to hunt down paratroopers, was not at his post. He was on the road driving to a war game in Rennes. At approximately for 30 hours, Effali heard the roar of the fleet. He understood immediately that the exercise was over and the war was here. He ordered his driver to turn around and race back. He never made it back to his headquarters at Chateau de Berneville. A small group of lost American paratroopers had set up. From the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, they had set up an impromptu ambush. They were not part of a grand plan. They were simply men who saw a road and decided to hold it when the car approached. First Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan opened fire. Effali was killed as he tried to escape the vehicle, becoming the first general. Before he could issue a single order to the division designed to stop this exact attack, he was dead in a ditch that morning. The German response was decapitated before it even began. This paralysis extended up and down the chain of command immediately. General Friedrich Dahlmann, the commander of the 7th Army, was also absent, attending the war game in Rennes that night. In fact, half of all division commanders and a quarter of all regimental commanders in the co-tent were away from posts. They were far away from their posts when the sky began to fall, while the German calm and struggled to understand the event. While the enemy slept, the American paratroopers were living through their own nightmare. The drop was a catastrophe of dispersion. Thick cloud cover had forced pilots to break formation while heavy anti-aircraft fire scattered them further into the dark. Men jumped early, late, or simply whenever the green light flashed in the panic. Chaos reigned inside the fuselage of planes. Of the nearly 7,000 men of the 101st Airborne Division, only 1 in 6 landed on their designated zones. The 508th Regiment of the 82nd saw only 25% of its men land within a mile of targets. Private First Class Bob Nobles landed in a farmer's field completely alone. He had lost most of his equipment during the exit. He could hear gunfire in every direction, but he had no idea where he was. The night was confusing and hostile to him. His first contact with a friendly force was not a coordinated link-up. It was a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness. The figure was screaming, "Do not shoot, I am from Kokomo, Indiana. I forgot the password." The voice was filled with sheer panic. Nobles laughed. Surrounded by the enemy miles from safety, he laughed. This was the spirit of the American paratrooper then. Not a disciplined automaton, but a human being improvising, adapting, refusing to be paralyzed by the absurdity of his situation. The German defenders were overwhelmed by reports that made no sense. They are in the marshes. They are in the village. They are in the fields. The word that appeared again in all German diaries and reports was the word everywhere. How do you concentrate your forces against an enemy that is everywhere and yet nowhere simultaneously in the dark night? The German General Staff called the confusion of battle Krieg, Nebel, the fog of war. But this was a fog unlike anything. It was total uncertainty. In the absence of clear orders, the German machine stalled. But the American machine kept working. Broken into thousands of tiny pieces, it kept working. This is where the cultural difference became decisive that night. American culture in the 1930s and 40s emphasized practical problem solving and individual initiative. These men had grown up fixing cars, tinkering with radios, figuring things out for themselves without waiting for help. When the plan failed, they did not wait for orders. They went to work. Take the case of 1st Lieutenant Richard Winters. Easy Company 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He landed near Sainte Marie du Mont with no weapon. By dawn, he had gathered a motley crew of 12 men from various units. His orders were to destroy a German battery. The artillery battery at Brecourt Manor was firing on Utah Beach. When Winters scouted the position, he found guns. He found for 105mm howitzers defended by a trench system, machine gun nests and 60 soldiers. 12 men against 60. Light infantry against an entrenched artillery position. By all rational military calculations, Winters should have withdrawn. Instead, he wrote a new textbook on small unit tactics in real time during the assault. He divided his tiny force using machine guns for suppression, while he led a small assault team down the trench line. It was a brutal close-quarters fight. Winters and his men took the guns one by one, spiking them with TNT. In 3 hours of fighting, they killed 15 Germans, routed the rest, and captured a map showing every German gun position. This was not the work of a massive, coordinated army. It was the work of a dozen men who saw a job and did it. Similar scenes played out across the countryside. In St. Mere, Eglise, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led a small group. His men were exhausted, some armed only with pistols and knives because they had lost their equipment bundles in the drop. They took the town anyway. They cut down the swastika flying over the town hall and raised an American flag. Near Mezzi Eris staffs, Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Regiment became a one-man army that day. Ordered to clear a barracks complex and seeing his men hesitate, Summers kicked open the first door and sprayed the room. He did not stop. For 5 hours he moved from building to building, kicking doors and clearing rooms tirelessly alone. By the time he was done, he had killed over 30 German soldiers single-handedly. He was later nominated for the medal. But the Germans just knew him as another terrifying example of American aggression. This aggression confused the Germans deeply. German intelligence officers noted in their reports that American paratroopers attacked when they should have defended positions. They took risks that seemed foolhardy. They pressed forward despite casualties that would have caused other units to break. Von der Heydte, the German paratroop commander, had a personal encounter with this new enemy on the morning of June 6th. His men captured several American Pathfinders near Coherent. Von der Heydte was struck by their appearance. Many had shaved their heads into mohawks and painted their faces for battle, he remarked to his staff. Now they are sending us their Indians, but the captured Americans were Avi. They told Von der Heydte that the American force on the peninsula was 10 times larger than it actually was. The scattered drops creating the illusion of a massive force made the lie believable. Von der Heydte hesitated, expecting a massive conventional attack while the Americans used the time to consolidate their positions. The battle for Coherent that followed was savage. Von der Heydte's regiment, the 6th Falls Kai, or M. Jaeger, fought fiercely. They earned the nickname the Lions of Coherent, but they were being pushed back by men who refused to quit. At one point during a truce to collect the wounded General Maxwell, Taylor demanded Von der Heydte surrender. Von der Heydte, bound by orders and duty, refused. But the American attitude was encapsulated perfectly by a young captain from the 101st who asked a German officer during the parley, "Would you surrender in the same situation?" This defiant spirit became legendary later in the war. During the Battle of the Bulge, when the 101st was surrounded at Bastogne, the German commander demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McCall sent back a one-word reply: nuts. The German officers were baffled. An American colonel had to translate it for them. The general's answer is no. But back in the hedgerows of Normandy, the fight was evolving into something even more terrifying for the German soldier. The Bocage country was a maze of earthen walls and thick vegetation. It was a sniper's paradise. And here the Americans transformed from paratroopers into hunters. German paratrooper Erwin Schmieger, a veteran of the 9th Parachute Regiment, recalled the terror of facing these men near St. Lo. He described the Americans as madmen. He remembered one night vividly. He and his comrades were in foxholes, spaced 50 meters apart along a wood line. In the darkness, he could hear the faint rustle of movement. No artillery, no shouting, just silence. Then a scream cut through the night. A German soldier in a nearby foxhole had been killed, his throat cut silently in the dark. Schmieger spent the rest of the night trembling in his hole, staring into the blackness, knowing the Americans were out there creeping closer. This was psychological warfare of the most primitive kind. The Americans had learned to use the terrain to move at night to kill silently. They adapted. They welded steel prongs to their tanks to bust through the hedgerows. They coordinated artillery with infantry in ways the Germans could not match. In the aftermath, as German officers sat in prisoner camps, writing their memoirs and analyses for the U.S. Army Historical Division, they tried to make sense of what happened. The Von der Heydte report noted with frustration that the enemy airborne troops, despite being isolated, had fought with a tenacity that compressed the German defenses. Von der Heydte, writing his manuscript B839, offered perhaps the most insightful analysis. He had expected the Americans to fight like Europeans, to follow the rules of war, to calculate risk and reward. He expected rational behavior always. But the Americans, he concluded, treated war not as a science but as a problem to be solved. When their leaders were ill, privates took command. When their units were shattered, they fought as individuals. They were unpredictable. In the end, the chaotic drop on June 6, 1944, was not the failure it seemed on the maps. It was a psychological masterstroke of warfare. It paralyzed the German Heimwehr, and it froze their reserves, and it unleashed thousands of aggressive soldiers. Improvising soldiers into the German rear, the German officer corps, trained to fight a war of order, found themselves losing a war of chaos. They wrote about these paratroopers with fear, yes, but also with a grudging, undeniable respect. They were the men who fell from the sky, and in the confusion and the darkness found a way to win. That is the lesson of Normandy. If you want to uncover more tactical secrets from history, smash that like button and subscribe now. I am your strategy observer. Keep your powder dry and I will see you on the next battlefield.